It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce Oliver Morton, who's going to chair this evening's event. But first, just some practicalities. We're not expecting any fire drills this evening. Make your way out if you hear a fire alarm through any of the emergency exits. And the congregation point is near the small hall, which is over that way. The Cambridge Climate Lecture Series was set up last year in the memory of David Mackay, and we continue to remember him, and it's very important that we take climate change very seriously. This evening, the panel discussion is on the theme of climate change is now, and the urgency of dealing with climate change. Oliver Morton, our chair, is from The Economist, and he was energy environment editor, now a Briefings editor. He's very much at the forefront of climate change discussions and written several books on the subject of climate change and on the subject of geoengineering. It's a great pleasure then to invite Oliver to start this evening off. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, as Hugh said, we are amply provided with fire exits, and should a sense of imposing doom come upon you, please do use one. It's always, I never come to this hall without thinking about the first time I came here, which is particularly poignant this week because it was to hear Carl Sagan give a talk, and the first question, I was first year undergraduate, the first question I was awestruck to note was by Stephen Hawking, who rolled on and asked something which I completely forget because I was just so starstruck. So I'm not sure we're quite at the Sagan-Hawking level this evening, but we will try and give you a particularly entertaining hour and a half about a subject almost as non-entertaining as the one that Carl Sagan was talking about. Sagan was talking to us about nuclear winter, a rather more abrupt climate catastrophe than that which we're discussing this evening, but one to which there is a certain link. If you count out the seconds, you can think about how much energy is going into the climate system. And the answer is it's about 10 Hiroshima bombs every second. We are involved in a slow war against the atmosphere and the ocean. And the slow war is going to go on and on. So that gives us two different versions of our title, Climate Change is Now. Climate Change is Now, my wife has told me that in South Africa there's a distinction between now, which means now, and just now, which means really not so much now. And I'd like to point out that climate change is now, but it's also rather just now, because there's a group led by the great American, thought leader, God, what a horrible term, great American person, Stuart Brand, has founded a group called the Long Now Foundation, which is devoted to looking at human affairs as though the year was not the period of interest, but rather the century or even the millennium. They insist on putting zeros before dates to remind you that it's only an accident of the calendar that we currently only have 4 numerals in our dates. We could have 5 or 6. Anyway, the Long Now Foundation is also concerned with climate change, as it should be, because climate change is long now as well as now. It's one of the only, possibly the only political crisis we've ever come across, which is also a long-term change in the relationship between society and nature. This is something that plays out both in our decisions every day and in the future that we face and that our descendants face over centuries or even perhaps millennia. And so I'm giving the speakers, the panelists, some room for maneuver there. Anywhere between the second of the 10 atomic bombs or the millennium of an ice age averted, it's all climate change now. So our first speaker, we have 3 speakers. They'll each give a talk for 5 or 10 minutes. Then we'll gather up on these luxurious chairs and ask each other a few questions, and then you will ask them questions, and it will all be over by 9 o'clock. Some of you, when I say you, are not actually here. Some of you are in the Twitterverse, I believe, I hope. Those of you so situated and inclined can send us questions on hashtag CCLS2018, if I remember correctly, and they will be transmitted to me by the miracle of someone writing them on a piece of paper and handing them to me. But that doesn't mean that those of you in the audience are in any way let off the duty of asking your own questions to our eminent panel. So our first panelist is Renee Karunungan, who is a graduate student at the University of East Anglia, and I think first and foremost she'd want me to say a climate activist. She's an outreach officer for Climate Tracker, the outreach manager indeed, as well as studying media and international development. She writes, she agitates, she educates, she reaches out, and she is also the author of a children's book on the environment that was listed as one of the best Filipino children's books of 2017. And so on that recommendation, I will ask Renee to come to the stage. Renee, please.
Thank you for the introduction. Okay, great. I'll be staying here because, as you can see, I am almost just as tall as the tarpaulin. So I want everyone to see me and hear me. I am Renee. I am Climate Tracker's outreach manager. And I'll be talking about Climate Tracker, what we do, why it's important for climate change being now and now. So Climate Tracker, we are a group of young journalists, around 7,000 now around the globe, and we write about climate change stories, climate change issues in our countries, in our communities, and in our regions. And it is important for us to be able to communicate climate change to the public, and I'll tell you why. So this is now, right? We are facing climate change impacts. A lot of communities are going to sink, are already sinking. This is also now. A lot of communities are facing drought, food security problems. And this is also now. Extreme weather events, climate change impacts are happening all over the world. And those who are in the front lines usually don't have the information about climate change. And usually their stories are not told in mainstream media. So Climate Tracker is a platform for young people to be able to tell the stories of what's happening in their communities and hopefully create an impact with their government, local government, national government, change policies, and help build resiliency of people who are in the front lines of climate change. Now, this is also now. Climate solutions are happening. Renewable energy is on the rise. Wind farms, solar farms, urban gardening, and even resilient agriculture is happening. So there are many solutions on the ground, not just on a national level, but as well as in the grassroots level. A lot of communities have the knowledge to adapt and to be resilient to climate change. And these stories need to be told as well, because we need to learn from each other. If one community is doing something and they are able to become resilient and adapt to climate change, then that story needs to be told so that other communities can learn from it. We need to be a community. The global arena needs to be connected to each other so that we can adapt to the changing climate. Oops. Now, this is also now. These are young people. This is a photo from the United States. And these are young people suing their government for the systematic problem that has come to be climate change. Young people believe that someone or a lot of people need to be accountable. And most of the time, this is the bigger problem. These are big companies. These are governments who have done nothing for the past years and decades. Young people understand that climate change is happening now, but we are also going to face more impacts, worse impacts of climate change, and we are going to live through it. This is also now. A lot of individuals are changing their lifestyles, becoming vegetarians because they understand that the meat industry or the agriculture industry contributes a lot to climate change. So a lot of people are doing individual things to change what is happening now for a better and more sustainable planet. And this is also now. A lot of movements are happening around the world to change what we are used to. And why is this important, that we communicate what's happening, these disruptions? Because communicating also changes the narrative. We can change the story. We're not just victims of climate change. We can also do something about climate change. But also, we tell the story of seeking for climate justice, of seeking our rights to the future as young people. And I have to say that now, there is hope, there is action, and there is resistance. And these are the stories that we need to tell. We need to disrupt. Our narratives need to change. We need to have a better communication to close the gap between scientists and the public for better understanding of what's happening and allow the people to understand and to change for a better planet. So, thank you, and I will be at the panel later if you have any questions.
Thank you, Renee. Our next speaker is Professor Sir David King, who has done a great many extremely important things. Most recently, he was the Foreign Office's Special Representative for Climate Change. He's also been the government's Chief Scientific Advisor. He's also been the director of the Smith School for Enterprise and Environment at Oxford. And he's also been head of the chemistry department at Cambridge. He thinks about science and technology in many different ways. He looks at their impacts, like when they are involved in something like a foot and mouth epidemic, for example, or flooding, or possibly being the root cause of some aspects of obesity. He also looks forward. He was director of the government's Foresight program and also chaired the Global Science and Innovation Forum. And so to look forward, we have Sir David.
Oliver, thank you very much. Delighted to be here with you. I too feel this is a bit high. I'm just going to quickly run through some of the political actions that took place from 1992 through to famously 2015. That's the length of time it took the United Nations process, 190 countries, to finally get to an agreement. Now that piece of time is time lost, and one could feel desperate with that lost time. So let me just summarize why I do on the one hand feel desperate, and on the other hand, I still feel we can manage this problem. We must not throw in the towel. So first of all, let me... right, on the chair. And I didn't even see you do it. All right. So first of all, what did we agree in Paris 2015? We agreed first and foremost that we would commit actions to see that the temperature rise since the pre-industrial period should be no more than 2 degrees, much less than 2 actually, and aim for 1.5 if at all possible. Now let me say, I was one of those, and the other people were all from the small island states pushing for that 1.5 degrees, and we got the British government to back that up. And that really is why 1.5 degrees is there. I'm going to say to you, the reason 1.5 degrees is there is because of the risk associated with any temperature rise above the present. But as we move towards 2 degrees, the risk to our global societies simply is going to be too challenging. So it's not there as a piece of greenwash. We really need to be aiming to see what we can do to achieve staying at or even below 1.5 degrees. We're already at 1.1, so it does sound like an enormous challenge. Now, the second agreement was to accept a bottom-up process. Kyoto was top-down, couldn't work. Bottom-up has worked, we've got agreement, but it means that every nation was simply asked, what can you do to assist that process? They each produced nationally determined contributions to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And what is shown on this slide is what we discovered once we had added up all of the contributions from each country. So what you see is billions of tons of carbon dioxide emitted on the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis, time from 2010 out to 2100. The agreement only goes to 2030, and so if you see the 2030 line here, that is as far as the agreement goes, and here there's a kind of optimistic tailing off after 2030. It's more sharp than was agreed through these nationally determined contributions. So China's agreement is in the yellow color, India the next in pink, United States, etc. So this all adds up. If you see, we've carefully taken out of this presentation the land use changes, and that's critically important because it demonstrates that deforestation, continued deforestation, as the blue at the top, is equivalent to the emissions, roughly speaking, from, let us say, between the United States and China today. It's a very big part of the problem. And what we need to do, of course, is to create new carbon dioxide sinks. So we've got to reforest rather than deforest. So this is just an illustration of that. Now, what does that leave us with, that supposed decrease? It leaves us with a 3.5 to 4 degrees centigrade world even by the end of this century. So that's not looking forward into next century when it would keep rising. Let's ask the question, what do we need to do to achieve 1.5 degrees with a 50% chance? All of these things have to be done with statistics. And what you see in the pale green curve, and it doesn't mean it to be pale green, it should be nice bright green, is the line we would need to follow in order to stay within the 1.5 degrees centigrade target with a 50% chance. And what you have in red is the 2 degrees centigrade. All right, so the agreement that we reached in the first place is that we need to be somewhere between these two. It means net zero emissions by 2035. We've just got 20 years to get there. And then if we are happy with 2 degrees, and I don't think we should be, we've got till 2055. Now, this is saying that none of the nationally determined contributions from any part of the world are sufficient to manage this transition. There is a sense of optimism eventually going to emerge, but I'm first of all now going to say, when I was secondly in the British government in the Foreign Office, I immediately started work on a risk analysis program, bringing in actuaries from the reinsurance industry, who are people who, of course, unlike scientists, are used to dealing with very low risks but high impact phenomena. You take out an insurance against your house burning down, not because you know it's going to burn down, but because even if it's got a very small chance, it's a big damage to you. So we worked with India, China, the governments of those two countries cooperated with us. We had admirals, generals, security service people in the team of 110 people. We worked for a year in those two countries, and we had people from other countries as well as from Britain assisting in the climate change, the analysis. But the main thing was that we came up with a series of risks. Actually, it was the governments of India and China that we asked to come up with these risks, which included heat stress, rising sea levels, as we've seen, with storms at sea creating massive flooding, really in both India and China on a very large scale, and crop failure. The most imminent challenge, it turns out, is rice crop failure across the whole of China, Indonesia, and the biggest rice paddy fields in the world in Vietnam, where rising sea levels are likely to flood the paddy fields there. Now, of course, when we took this risk analysis, we also did, in addition to looking at singular risks, we did a systemic analysis. Now, this has been published, Climate Change, a Risk Analysis by the Foreign Office. It's on their website. Do have a few drinks before you read it, because actually it's not a very happy read, because beyond the middle of the century, it's difficult to see how we manage, for example, with a crisis of the kind where the people of Bangladesh can no longer live in Bangladesh because of the frequency of flooding, and the people of Calcutta can no longer live in Calcutta because of the frequency of flooding. Where do 110 million people go when they need to move somewhere else? Where in the planet is there a big sign saying, come to our country? Right, so there's all sorts of big systemic challenges facing us as we go forward. There's the nature of the challenge, but of course, as we move forward, we know that all of this implies considerably more work to be done than is in place today. So what I really want to now say, can I stop it there? Right. What I now want to say is, what am I most worried about? It's what's happening in the Arctic region. And of course, the rapid melting of the Arctic sea ice, and David Wadhams, the Cambridge figure, has been patiently measuring it. These are his figures back to 1980, patiently measuring the thickness of that sea ice, traveling in submarines underneath it, etc., over many years. And what he predicted was 2016, there will be no more sea ice. Now, people say, well, come on, Peter's exaggerating. Actually, the ice that's left there is so thin that Russian ships are now traveling across the North Pole, even now in the winter, because the ice is thin enough for the ships to break through. So what we're left with, even in the winter, is really thin ice. We expose the sea below in the summer, and the net result is that the Arctic region is heating up at more than twice the rate of the rest of the planet. So if we talk about the Arctic region, it's already above the 2 degrees centigrade level. And what is worrying about that, of course, is not the melting sea ice causing sea level change. It doesn't if it's sea ice, but right next to it is Greenland, and if all of the ice in Greenland, one please. If all of the ice in Greenland, the left-hand figure here, should melt, sea level rises around the whole world would rise by 7 meters. But if we just have 1 meter sea level rise, the catastrophe is with us in terms of Calcutta, etc. When I say Calcutta, etc., let me just add in London, New York, all the other cities that would be severely at risk. Cities based on coastlines are severely at risk from rising sea levels and storms at sea. In the center there is a picture of the polar vortex, the lower polar vortex, and the distortion that is taking place. I was recently talking about this in Dallas, Texas, where the temperature when I was there was minus 15 degrees centigrade. Dallas has never experienced on record anything approaching that. And at the same time, at the North Pole, we've had 60 days above zero. Right, so in other words, the hot spot in the middle of the Arctic is pushing the cold air down and around. And so we have this consequential phenomenon that it's freezing cold around these areas, and we're seeing unusual weather. So what do we need to do to manage these problems? We need to move on from mitigation, that is avoiding the use of fossil fuels. We must talk about climate restoration. Mitigation is the first priority. But the second priority is create more carbon sinks. We have to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And it's certainly my belief that we actually need to manage these risks through this century and into the next. We need to pull it down to about 350 parts per million. And in order to achieve that, we're going to have to create a whole set of new carbon dioxide sinks. I'm not simply talking about reforestation or mangroves. These are very important carbon sinks. But we also need to look at the oceans, for example. Russ George is with us here, and he's very keen to talk about iron fertilization in the deep ocean to create carbonaceous matter that will sink down several miles to the bottom of the ocean. So the objective of the climate restoration program is to attempt to restore the planet to a situation it was in the pre-1950 level. If we just remember what we learned through the Brundtland report on sustainability, it was leave the planet in a state that is at least as good as the state it was in when you arrived. And I'm an old guy. I was born in 1939. So I've got to say it's got to be 1950 or earlier that we return to. Here's the little hope. We've heard a talk from Renee about the technologies. I also love the technologies. This is a British company producing an airship that uses helium to lift it. It uses sunlight to drive it, so those are electric motors. And it has a massive freight container underneath it. That freight container capable of carrying 20 fully loaded ship's containers. So what you're talking about here is a complete revolution. It's got an onboard crane, so you simply lift the containers into the airship as it's floating over Spain, picking up tomatoes, and then dropping them off at the Sainsbury's depot in Britain. You're looking at something that is transformational, and it's challenging, and it's an opportunity. And I think this is really the right way to look at this problem. This is a very clever technique from Germany, Heindel, mining engineer, who just said, we can, using current mining techniques, create a cylinder of granite under the earth. This is a farmer's land above. And then when we have excess electricity on the grid, we pump that cylinder up. You tell the farmer you're going to do it, presumably. And then when you need electricity, you use the weight of the granite to drive water through a turbine, and you can store, if that measures about the size of a football pitch in the cross-sectional area, 250 meters deep, you're storing 1 billion watt-hours of electricity. In Britain, we'd need about 10 of these, and we can cope with all the intermittency from wind and solar. So these are the exciting opportunities that lie ahead. And the other exciting opportunity, and I'll sit down immediately after this, is, and we clean up the atmosphere. We create a healthy atmosphere for all of us to breathe. All of these clean new energy technologies are not emitting NOx and SOx as well as carbon dioxide. So let's get busy. Let's not give up at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I trust that your friends at Barrier Lift have been in touch with the estate of the late, great Jerry Anderson, because that looks suspiciously like Thunderbird 2 to me. Our third speaker is Lisa Walker, who is the CEO of Ecosphere Plus, which is a company dedicated to financing the protection of forests and the improvement of land sinks, finding natural technologies, natural approaches to bring down some of the carbon dioxide. That was the first biggest tranche in David's first slide. Lisa worked in oil and gas for a long time, and she did so mostly also by funding sustainability initiatives. She She was part of the Sustainable Gas Institute and the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is not the oxymoron that it might sound. And she's, throughout this, worked on financing through things like the BP Carbon Ventures corporate VC fund, which has secured financing of new and innovative sorts for all sorts of things, including the World Bank's Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. So, with no further ado, I will, and you should be very nice to her because she went through a hellish journey to get up here. So, with no further ado, here's Lisa.
Let me see if I learned this earlier properly. So again, we're on the screen. I'm a bit taller, so I'll stand over here. So thank you very much for having me here tonight. Yes, I'm Lisa Walker, the CEO of Ecosphere Plus, and yeah, it is perhaps a little unusual that I spent, well, the first 18 years of my career in the oil and gas sector, working at BP and then BG Group and very briefly Shell, when Shell bought BG in 2016. So I dedicated my career really the entire time to trying to find climate solutions, trying to find ways for businesses to work with governments and with individuals, looking at new technologies, but also looking at natural technologies. And that's what I wanted to talk about tonight, was how do we harness the power of nature as a climate solution, and how do we harness the power of individuals as well? What have we got to do with any of this, and how might we get involved if we do care? I won't spend too much time on this, but you know, systemic change is definitely needed, as we've heard from the great speeches we've already seen tonight. But I think it's actually, you know, it really is possible now, and there are many, many things going on in the world, you know, and feeding off of each other, whether it's pressures from regulation, not just energy regulation, but clean air regulation, prudential regulation about the financial risks of climate change, but also pressure from investors, pressures from consumers, exactly what Renee was talking about, and technology breakthroughs as well. So I do have some hope that actually we've got the right conditions, perhaps, to press reset. And we have a powerful ally, and I was delighted that David had actually a big blue blob on his chart at the top, which talked about land use, because for me it's a rather underappreciated and sometimes undervalued, but such a critical part of the climate change sort of solution set. You know, for me, climate change needs really systems level thinking. So we do need to understand the role of our trees and our forests, as well as our oceans, and these carbon sinks. You know, trees literally store carbon in their very fibers as they grow. And when you burn them down, all of that CO2 is released into the atmosphere. And never mind that, when you're talking about tropical forests that have, you know, developed over thousands of years, they really are irreplaceable natural assets. So worldwide, our forests currently store between 1 and 2 billion tons of carbon every year. And that's, you know, juxtaposed about the 10 billion tons that we emit when we burn fossil fuels and carry out other emitting activities. So they really, really are critical, and we absolutely need to think about them more. And, you know, for me, I spent a lot of my career, as I said, in the energy sector. The energy sector is absolutely critical to the transition, but, you know, we're here tonight talking about climate changes now, and for me, you know, there's one sector that can give us real near-term benefits. There's one sector that can go from being a net emitter today to actually a net negative technology provider in the future, and that's the land use sector, agriculture and forestry. And David already spoke about some of these different natural climate solutions, and we have more research, more evidence now on the kind of contribution they could make, but it's pretty staggering in the near term. So, you know, 50% of the emissions reductions, we need to find that gap David talked about. So here's the path we're on, and here's the path we need to be on. 50% of the near-term reductions, actually, we probably need to find in the land use sector. And even by 2030, that's still a hugely significant number, so 37%. But, around the world, unfortunately, we're not necessarily financing these at anywhere near the scale we need to, and not really understanding nature as such an important asset. So, I think there is some good news there, though, because, according to this latest study, there's 2 gigatons, so that's 2 billion tons of potential just by stopping deforestation, keeping our forests standing, which sounds like a sensible idea. And it's cost effective. We can afford to do it. It's $10 a ton of carbon. That might not mean much to you, but to put that into perspective, to capture and store the same amount of carbon, from the oil and gas sector would cost 10 times that. So, it is cost effective and it is possible. But I just wanted to add, the work I do now is very much in developing countries and getting finance into these much needed and fragile, threatened ecosystems. And the benefits actually on the ground, yes, there's a huge carbon benefit, but the amazing benefits are far beyond carbon and the climate. So, for us, global food security and protecting watersheds, but for people on the ground, actually, they need to have a sustainable pathway to develop. And they want to live in harmony with these amazing forest assets that they have, that have amazing meaning to them locally. And we can do all sorts of things by protecting those forests. So securing land tenure rights for indigenous communities and working in partnership with them, funding healthcare and empowering women and girls in different parts of the world, protecting and conserving the habitats of endangered species, the local ecosystem services, et cetera, et cetera. So, to me, there's such a huge upside and such a massive moral imperative to acting in this space, besides the hugely important part of the climate system that nature is involved in. But what does it mean to all of us, really? And how can we involve everybody? And what does it mean in my daily life, besides it being my job now, to actually protect the rainforests or invest into a more sustainable agroforestry system? What does that really mean for me? And do we really even want to be involved? Because, that's a key question. And according to the data from a company called Nielsen, we do want to be involved. And in fact, nearly 70% of us wouldn't even mind if it cost us just a little bit more to live in a more environmentally and socially responsible way. Well, that's great. And maybe that's driven by the fact that millennials now, have a spending power of nearly $2.5 trillion a year. And I think expect more from society and are more willing to be involved. And I think Renee made that point very well. So what excites me, yes, absolutely, the cool technologies that I would have loved to have been investing in my previous career that David pointed out. But I'm also so excited by the power of new digital technology. We now live in a hyper-connected world. That was a word I learned yesterday at Google. I love it. Hyper-connected to each other. But how can we use these technologies to be hyper-connected to nature, to be hyper-connected to our environmental impact? And what would that look like? We now have the power and the technology, to actually do that, to bring things like the carbon market down to the individual level. I'm involved with the project where we're trying to bring, the carbon footprint of every product and service onto your mobile phone. And imagine what that would do if we actually understood, as a first point in this process, what our carbon footprint really is and where does it come from. I grew up in the corporate world, and we always say, well, you manage what you measure. And for individuals, it's very difficult for us to even understand what carbon we use on a daily basis, how much deforestation is in a product we use. How about if we brought the carbon market and carbon pricing down to the individual level? What would that mean for us if we, offsetting or rebalancing our unavoidable emissions was as easy as swiping our credit card? Could we create a virtuous positive cycle and actually get that much needed finance to invest into into our natural assets, into our forests, into our communities that can keep our forests standing around the world? And how could that little carbon price on products and services actually incentivize companies financially to reduce and eventually remove carbon or remove deforestation from their products and services? And that's what really excites me about new kinds of technologies and really harnessing the power of people. And the opportunity, really is huge at an individual level. If we added just 10% of a penny to every card transaction, we could create between us, a sink of half a gigaton. That would be really helpful, I think, to David's chart, actually. And we have the power to do that, to collectively protect billions and billions of trees. So, that's what I would hope that we can all take on board, that yes, systemic change is needed. And systemic change is possible, I think, in a way that it hasn't been before. And yes, we need to be concerned, absolutely, and trust me, I am. But, I think we can be positive, but we also need to take action ourselves and take some responsibility. And I would hope that, maybe an outcome from tonight is that we might all have a little bit of a personal action plan, something that we can each personally contribute. And then collectively, that could be a really big impact between us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Stay up, yeah. Thank you very much, Lisa. Can I ask the other panelists to come up, please? I think we're going to get the panel to talk a bit amongst itself first, but thank you for being quick off the mark. I will come to you anon. I wanted first actually to ask, because I have 3 very interesting presentations, were there any things that you wanted to ask each other? No, you've all been thinking about your own part of it. Well, I wanted to ask something that came off first, that came to me while I was listening to Lisa, but which I think you might all want to chime in on. You talked about stopping deforestation and said it was a good idea and we can afford to do it. So I think that most of us in this room will probably have heard that being said for at least 2 decades. Maybe more since the 1992 Rio Convention. So given that it's a good idea and affordable, why is deforestation continuing?
Well, I think fundamentally it comes down to, one of the tools we have is putting a price on carbon. And we haven't managed to do that in a really sort of extensive way yet. There's a lot of willingness. We've invested into a lot of the what we call readiness in the policy-making world. But now we need to get actually large-scale capital out there into these projects. I work in a big impact investment fund. There is a big pipeline of projects, and there are, I think, investment firms starting to see natural capital as an important asset class. There's been so much focus and attention on investing into renewables and into green bonds and things like that, but none of that finance in the private sector has really reached into the forestry side. So, for me on the financing side, I think putting a price on carbon, creating some willingness and some demand, creating awareness amongst the public of deforestation. It's very difficult to know what deforestation is in your products and services. I recently wrote to my pension provider because I wanted to understand, how much deforestation, and I don't expect I'm going to get a response for many months because I know that they don't know. So I think there's just a lot that needs to be done on awareness raising, on financing, and just a commitment, a willingness to do it, and more focus because, like I said, for me, the focus has been so much on the energy transition, but our carbon sinks are just as important, and in fact, in the near term, they're really essential.
So if I've got 100 quid and I want to make a difference, and there are 10,000 of me, do I do more for the climate by investing in your fund than I do by investing in renewable energy?
Well, I think the answer is we need people to do both.
Yes, but that wasn't quite the question, though.
Well, it depends.
Which one actually brings down carbon more?
At the moment, investing into deforestation is probably more needed and more additional because you've got a lot of policies, a lot of financing already going into renewables. So, I would say it depends on.
So
your
I should go for the
perspective.
little fund that could.
Well, I think if you talk to people on the ground, you know, in these communities, I know what their answer would be, which is keep our forest standing, please, because we rely on it for so many more things than just, you know, the atmosphere we all share.
Yes,
Sorry,
absolutely, Renee.
Can
Yes.
I
Which,
ask Lisa something?
of course.
I believe that carbon sinks are important and that we need to stop deforestation, but there's also an issue of, you know, forest peoples and also like people who are protecting the forest being in constant danger of protecting the forest, you know, from companies who continue to do it. So how do we actually protect these people who are protecting the forest? That's my question.
Well, I mean, I think there's lots of different models. The way we do it is investing into sustainable alternative livelihoods, so that you're, you know, actually finding ways to have companies work in harmony with the forest and work in harmony with the communities that protect the forest, and creating partnerships around that, so that you've got everybody actually on the same side rather than fighting against each other. But it is a challenge, and it takes time. But, you know, we have to do it. There's no way around it. We can't get to the pathways we need to get to and lose our forests. The two are not possible together.
Right.
So,
David, I want to come to you. You pointed out the difference between Copenhagen and Paris, the difference between the top-downness of, going back further, the top-downness of Kyoto and the bottom-upness, bring your own carbon policy aspects of Paris. And it's very true that Paris was were all of us in Paris? Yeah. So Paris was an extraordinary and very inspiring event. But at the same time, you heard Lisa talk about the need for a strong carbon price to drive the sort of things that she does. There's not going to be a strong carbon price on a bottom-up basis. So how do you square those two things? How do you square the need for sort of like global levels of ambition with a policy framework that's now all about just what individual countries offer?
So in a way, I'm going to answer both your questions at once.
Excellent. That's very efficient.
So £100, should you spend on renewables or forests? I've got a straightforward answer. Spend it on forests. Why? Renewables, for most countries between the tropics, are now competitive with fossil fuels, and the price is still coming down, and this market is rapidly reaching across the world. 2015, the same year as the December Paris Agreement, IEA estimates that more than 50% of all new power structures for electricity production around the whole world were renewable energy. And what produced that was, let me very quickly say, Germany starting feed-in tariffs 1989, Britain coming in 1997, and spreading across Europe and then California. Those feed-in tariffs were actually initially very expensive. This was a way of creating an artificial market for these goods, photovoltaics and wind in particular. And as the market grew, the price just kept falling and falling exponentially. And it's still falling for all of these. This is a very important lesson, because the market is the best friend we've got when we get to that place. So I'm saying renewables is looking after itself now. And I'm going to come to your point, but I just want to say that the carbon market and carbon pricing down to the individual level, which is what Lisa was saying, I don't think this had a chance of getting agreement. How can we get an agreement when you know what President Putin has just said, climate change will be good for Russia? He might have just said it, but actually I can tell you Bedritsky, the lead negotiator for Russia, I know him well, has been saying this for 20 years. Right? So it's the Russian position. Now, if Russia is pushed into an agreement where they are forced to accept a carbon price, they're simply going to say no, end of agreement. So it is very difficult to get an agreement like that. Instead, we have an evolution. China, for example, is the latest country to join in with carbon cap and trade. And so let me just move on to Copenhagen, Paris, top-down, bottom-up. essential to get agreement. Copenhagen, I wrote an op-ed in the week before Copenhagen saying there cannot be an agreement because the Americans had said we cannot sign an agreement. This was President Obama because his Senate and Congress had not allowed him to sign an international agreement which was telling the United States what to do. And Russia, no, not Russia, China had said, if the Americans don't sign, we don't sign. No point. Right? So there was no agreement emerging before we went into the Copenhagen meeting. And we learned that lesson. And so the bottom-up, and it's not purely bottom-up, but the bottom-up is critically important. We, Britain, and I know this may come as a surprise, set an example on all of this. Right? We did. We have reduced our emissions by 42% compared with 1990. We're the first country to say we will reduce by 80% by 2050. Now, of course, that's not enough, but nevertheless, we've been on track for some time. But what may be surprising to this audience is David Cameron, when he came in and I went back into the Foreign Office, created an international climate fund funded entirely by the British government, initially at £4.7 billion, and then he added another £4.5 billion in October 2015. And what are we doing with that? We're working with developing countries.
How did you stop the Daily Mail from finding out?
This is exactly why I was never allowed to go on television and radio.
That was after the terrorism thing?
No. This was just from Number 10 saying, if the Daily Mail, the Sun, and all the others ran a campaign, you might have your funding cut. But this is what gave us a strong negotiating position, developing countries all backing the position we were taking, because we were actually capable of funding money. Now, on the forests, we created with Germany and Norway a New York Forest Declaration, 2014. 34 of the most forested countries in the world have signed up to an agreement which says we will stop all deforestation by 2025, and by 2030 we will have reforested an area the size of India, the total area reforested around the world. This is equivalent to a new carbon sink equal to all of the emissions from the United States today. So, and how much money has Britain, Norway, and Germany put in? About $6 billion. It's not enough, but we are shifting with all of those partner countries. We're shifting the game. It needs to go much more quickly. I'm not suggesting we've done enough, but I just want to say public sector action really is required from all the developed nations. And Britain has led the way. Our 9 billion in total, a little more than 9 billion that we've put into our own International Climate Fund, and we put 1.2 billion into the Green Climate Fund in Korea. And that whole fund was at $11 billion until President Trump withdrew $2 billion. So it's sitting at $9 billion. The British effort is bigger than the international effort through the Green Climate Fund.
Thanks so much. And I must say that I think you're probably a better environmentalist than a financial advisor, because it's very strange to hear someone say, look, renewable energy is a booming market. Everyone's buying it. Invest in something else. We have, I think, a good half...
You're going to invest in something else because he pays you.
That's right. So, but I did actually ask. I want to get rid of carbon, and I'm very aware of the idea that if I invest in a good carbon fund, I'll probably do better than renewables. Someone's beeping. They stop. Thank you. We have a good half hour for questions, and the young man in the stripy shirt has been very patient, so I'm going to go to him first. Okay, apparently that's no longer needed. So right at the front there, I might take 2 or 3 questions at once. It depends on my mood.
Okay, so...
Could you say who you are? I mean, don't feel forced, but it's always nice to know.
Yeah, my name's Michael. I'm a student from Denmark. I'm just kind of baffled about how it seems there are large like financial opportunities in different kinds of renewable and green energy, both because, as Lisa said, there are a lot of millennials that would like to actually spend the money on different types of green energy, and also because there are, it's more efficient, there's way less waste. So if it is such, if there is such so much money in that market, why aren't we seeing more large financial businesses investing in it from just purely earning more money?
Okay, and we'll take the question from straight behind you because it was in my eye. Yes, you please.
Hello everyone, my name is Evelyn. I'm from Ecuador and actually spent last year living in the rainforest in the Amazon region. And I can agree with all of you panelists that reforestation is the right way to go at this moment. There's a lot of capital going into renewable energies, and it's coming from your question, like, why do we have these big financial hedge funds advising investors directly not to invest in these causes, but pretty much not telling them what is the real value? I'm thinking perhaps it's because it's an investment in the long term, and how can we monetize this and make it more attractive for investment, venture capitals, etc.
Okay, so two somewhat linked questions there about how to incentivize investment, but also, if this is also good, why isn't more investment? This is the sort of like, this is the Economist's argument about why you never see £20 notes lying in the street, because someone will have picked them up. Well, you do sometimes see £20 notes lying in the street, but it's rare. So the question is, why aren't more people investing in this if it is as good as all three of you have made it sound? And how do we make the things that people aren't investing in more attractive? Any of you care to take on one of those? Lisa?
Well, I think he had his hand up.
Okay, he had his hand up.
So green energy opportunities, I would say that financial businesses are investing in green energy opportunities. So for example, what is the biggest growth sector in the UK economy? It's the new clean energy sector. How many people is it employing? The Minister for Energy recently announced it had just passed 440,000 people. It's a very intensive employer of people, and we need employment in this country. And what is its turnover? It's about 50, 60 billion pounds a year. So there is a massive investment occurring in this country and in countries around the world. And in terms of hedge funds, very good question. But I think, London was the initiator of the idea of green finance and green bonds, setting out and stipulating what you can finance in if you're going to be able to label it as green finance. And Roger Gifford is an ex-mayor of the City of London who leads this. And Roger and I have traveled around the world to stock exchanges, opening green bonds in South American countries around the world. It is really taking off. We're now talking about trillions of dollars sitting in green bonds, green finance around the world. So it is happening, but at the same time, to both of you, I really have another really important point to make. Subsidies for fossil fuels to keep fossil fuels going are still way, way bigger than any subsidies have ever been for renewable energy. And that is what's keeping it going. Venezuela is a key example, but Saudi Arabia, the Middle East generally, you cannot surely expect us to believe there's no subsidy if the price of petrol in your country is less than 10p a gallon. Right? So what you're looking at is massive subsidies keeping the oil and gas industry going. Now that is really what has to be stopped above all.
Can I also make, I think the financial community generally, though, is very much alive now to the fact that there is a financial risks and opportunities from this energy transition. I think they're much further along in terms of their engagement with energy companies. So there's really active group of investors now. There is something called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD, that was started by Mark Carney, who actually, it was the first time we had a governor of a central bank at COP21 in Paris. And that was a real shift, actually, in the sort of dynamics on policy, that it was actually prudential regulation, financial regulation sort of bearing down. But I think, there's more those sort of investors now are starting to understand and learn about the natural capital risks and opportunities. And so I hope that that will come. They're becoming more alive to it. Companies are now starting to disclose more the land use risks, what deforestation is in their portfolio, and hopefully more companies will invest in engagement in those activities. There's a very active divestment movement around fossil fuels. There isn't yet anything like that around the land use sector, but who knows, maybe that's something that will come. You know, there's the Keep It in the Ground campaign for fossil fuels. What about keep it in the ground for the trees?
Or put it back in the ground.
Or put it back in the ground, even better. Exactly, I mean, that's the sort of, that's the reserve of carbon we can make bigger, which is really exciting. So I think, you know, change will come, but that's really important. And I mean, to your point earlier on Paris, you know, yes, the policy is important, but, you know, my point is that actually there are a multitude of risks and opportunities. Investors are really important. Individuals are really important to companies as well. And, you know, you don't have to mandate carbon pricing. You can volunteer it. Companies have voluntarily taken on 100% renewables. If we could get companies to take on similar voluntary action in the land use sector, we could get a big kind of hopefully growing change as well.
Okay, I'm going to go up, having been down the front, I'm going up to the back. Question there. Yes, there we are. Yes, your hand right up at the back. So someone exercise for the microphones. Yes, meet it halfway. I'll take another one straight. Anyone else in that? Okay, red hoodie down there. The second question. First question.
Yeah, thanks very much for the talk. This question is a little bit directed to Sir David. About the new technologies that you are saying that they are clean and that they are powered with renewable energies. It's great, I agree. They are good and they are clean in terms of CO2 emissions, but we still need to be aware that they are not clean in terms of the minerals that they are being used to build these new technologies. Because they are mined in very unsustainable ways and they are mined abusing lots of human rights. So my question is, how is this issue addressed in these new technologies?
Okay, great. And you, sir?
In talking about conversion of land, whether it's forest or peatland or grassland, the driver of that seems to be the need for agricultural land above all, partly subsistence, but especially large industrial farming to supply China with soya and that kind of thing. And it's very, very profitable. So what is the element of changing global agriculture that has to come into your strategy if you're going to affect that part of the carbon emissions challenge?
Okay, we've got two quite divergent options. I'm going to throw in actually on the first one about the non-renewable resources that go into the renewable energy industry. I'm also going to throw in a question from the internet. I don't know who actually brought it in on Twitter, but it, I think, has a slight link, which is, do we need to prioritize wind and solar, or are tidal and hydroelectric power equally important? So first of all, the problem of poor working practices, bad extractive industries involved in the clean energy industry. Would anyone like to speak to that? Then I'm going to ask someone. Renee, when you encourage people, as I'm sure you do, to switch to renewable technologies, how much of these issues that were brought up by our questioner worry you?
How much does it worry me?
Yeah, how much does it worry you, this question of where do the rare earths come from, where do the specialty minerals come from?
Very much. Because when we talk about climate solutions, it's not just about solving climate change. It's about how humane it is. Taking into consideration, she's right, human rights. For example, if a company, solar company, decides to put a solar farm in actually a farmland or an agricultural land that's for the people, or maybe like wind farms in mountains where there are, for example, wildlife like birds that can be affected. That's not ethical, is it? So when we talk about climate change solutions, it has to be ethical and humane at the same time. Because I always say this, climate change is not about the environment. It's about people. And what we do with climate change and the solutions that we do is equally important.
Do you think that any of you think that the renewable energies industry gets a bit of a free pass on this?
Well, I mean, not in my experience, but, you know, I was part of a big corporate company that had obviously quite well-established safeguards in place. Obviously, accidents can happen and there can be problems, but, you know, certainly when I was involved in alternative energy, we were trying to apply the same high standards, right, and take a holistic view, because we did find that actually you might find, if you weren't careful, we heard instances that you could have child labor, you know, on a wind development in India or wherever. Now that wouldn't be something that would be ethical to invest in. It might be financially sound and good for the climate, but actually it's not something you should be doing. So I would hope that there are the same kind of standards being applied. But I think overall you need, as Renee said, you need a holistic approach. You can't just be myopic and say, well, this is good for CO2, let's forget everything else. And I think that's what we need to be mindful of. Otherwise, we might solve some CO2, we might find some great breakthroughs, but create other problems further down the line. So I think hopefully we've learned from the mistakes we have made actually over the last 100 years.
The other question was about the role of agriculture in land use change. If you want to store up more carbon dioxide, what do you do about agriculture?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you could see them as competing forces. I think actually, in my experience, it's much more interlinked. You need standing forests and you need good soil quality actually to have long-term food security. So there may be some short-term trade-offs and tensions, but actually you need the landscape to work in harmony with the agroforestry systems. And there's a lot being done on intensification of farming practices in a just and sound way, but also on how do you create those partnerships between the agroforestry system and the forestry system and the communities. You know, you need rain, so you need your rainforest at the most kind of simplest level. So I think that all helps, and changing the economic dynamics. So that's why valuing those externalities, placing a value on the carbon stored, on the cultural rights, the watershed, the biodiversity. If we were able to value all of that, actually, you know, we wouldn't be having this economic competition that maybe we're having right now.
Did you want?
I just want to make a very general point. What we have not been doing, as we've improved human well-being through science, technology, medicine, etc., for the past few hundred years, what we have not been doing is caring for the ecosystems. And that's all coming to visit us in this century. The payback time is here now. And so when you ask use of minerals, mining is unsustainably carried out, yes, you're right. But at the same time, we've got to reach a balance between managing our ecosystems and managing human well-being going forward. And we are going to be 9 billion plus people by mid-century, and we've got to manage the energy needed for the well-being of that bunch of people. And there will be some losses in that process, I'm afraid. If I just say to you, the biggest challenge today is what we're doing to the atmosphere through emissions. And climate change really is number one. But there are many, many other challenges as well. Now, agricultural land, very, very important question. This is a question also of our own behavior, because the biggest removal of forests comes from our demand for palm oil and our demand for beef. Those are the two biggest challenges to the forest.
Who's we there?
We, all of us. Don't we all eat meat? No, not all of us.
No, I wasn't thinking that, but I was also thinking, there are lots of people, for instance, people much poorer than us in China who use palm oil. The enrichment of poor Chinese people has led to an awful lot of palm oil use.
So I didn't say we, the rich world.
No, that's why I was asking.
But you're making a very important point. Beef consumption in China is now rising year on year, and that's all to do with improved finance As the GDP grows, beef production has to go up to meet the rising demand. So the first thing is, and I think you mentioned this, we have to change what we eat as we move forward in time. If we were all vegetarian, it would be a very much easier task to manage forests and to manage the land in order that we can produce all the food that is needed. But it's a much bigger question. For example, if we can raise the carbon content of all farmlands in the world, we could fix as much carbon as about 1/7 of the world's total emissions today. Right? So in other words, fixing carbon, and the most important way to do this, believe me, is radical composting. The British government conducted very expensive experiments in Ethiopia and East Africa. Farm productivity in those two areas after 5 years increased by 4 to 5-fold. Because once you've got composting, earthworms are back in there, and water retention in the soil goes up enormously. So we just have to be very sensible about how we use land going forward.
Okay,
if I could just say one thing that we
Very
can
quickly, 'cause
all do though is with food waste.
Right.
Right, that's something, you know, that we can all take action on actually, and personal responsibility. And food waste, if it was a country, it'd be the third biggest actually in the world in terms of CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions, right? So it's, you know, that's something that we can do right now, and I think, you know, particularly in rich developed nations, we are very guilty of, and I think that's something we could all do.
a couple more questions. I'm going back. Okay, yes, you on the aisle there, with and in front of you and slightly to the right, wearing something in a brownie sort of colour. Yes. But first of all, yes, you right at the back. Yes.
The commitments made in Paris to reach 2 degrees, but the commitments they made don't actually get...
the commitment was less than
at least 1.5. The commitments don't actually add up, the bottom-up commitments don't add up to 2-degree pathway, and I wondered whether you felt the politics could actually get us to 2 degrees, or whether it would be changes in the real economy that come and drive that transition.
So could you just be a little clearer on what you mean about how you distinguish politics and the real economy?
The commitments that governments will make, whether they can make those changes in their NDCs that will get you to a 2-degree pathway, or whether those, the pathway to 2 degrees will be driven not by the politics but by real economy changes.
Okay, and in front of you and to the left, yes.
Hello, you spoke about a large percentage of consumers being willing to pay more to live a kind of greener lifestyles, but how do you make it easier for these people to actually do it, so it's become more than just saying you would like to do it or would be willing to do it, but actually make that change in your life?
Okay, two things there that we can... 2-degree pathway. Can governments ratchet up? There's the, what I still think of as the facilitative dialogue, but it's got another name now, which is meant to ratchet up the government commitments. Or is it the markets? Or I think I want to put in a third one here. Is it just something that's not going to happen? Because I think that's something that we've all been really rather positive. Well, you've all been really rather positive on the panel. How realistic do you think it is to think that there's a good chance of not hitting the 2-degree target? Yes, Renee.
I do think, I mean, we want to keep hoping, but for me, and also as like a climate activist, maybe from the viewpoint of a climate activist, it's going to be really difficult, especially if countries are very concerned about GDP and economics. That's why we keep saying that the problem of climate change is an economic problem. It's a systemic problem because we've been in this system of consumerism where we basically say that being successful means being able to consume more, means being rich, and that's a national problem as well. And if we only think about our own national interests and growing our economies and our GDPs, I think, how do we solve it?
So, I mean, I would say you're right, there is a big gap between where governments, their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions will get us and where we need to go. For me, I think it's going to be a combination of both the political sort of ratcheting up, the Talanoa sort of dialogues, as they're called. So, yeah, the ratcheting sort of up of ambition and down of emissions. But for me, it's not going to happen realistically, unless there's action across all the different sectors of the economy, individuals changing their behavior, corporates and businesses changing their behavior, investors getting engaged, getting active, divesting their money, reinvesting it into other things. So, I mean, I think it can't be both, because otherwise we'd be back in the kind of Kyoto Protocol world. So that, the Paris Agreement invites bottom-up action, and it invites action from corporates, from individuals. So I think it's not going to happen if we don't actually make it happen.
Following that on to the second of those questions, what's something that any of the three of you, or all of the three of you, would do to make it easier for people to make a difference?
So for me, like I said, harnessing these great new technologies that actually allow people to understand what on earth a carbon footprint actually is. There's a really cool app in China. It was released by Alibaba's company, with Ant Financial. It's a bit like PayPal, I suppose. It's called Ant Forest, and they got 200 million Chinese citizens using this app, which gave them their individual carbon footprint, and it gamified it and incentivized them to reduce their carbon footprint, and then they actually planted trees in the real world. So, like things like that for me, making it real for us. I've been waiting a long time for some sort of, easy way to understand what I actually do emit in my daily life, and that would really empower me and educate me.
Renee?
Yeah, I think though there's a danger if we only talk about lifestyle of shifting the responsibility just to individuals, when there are companies, for example, that have already the big responsibility, like the fossil fuel industry. So I think as much as individual actions are important because they amount to bigger things, and I think that's where climate communication is actually important, giving information, access to information. How can we all individually create these changes in our individual lives? But at the same time, we have to allow people to understand how bigger companies or nations, for example, have done a lot of damage and give platform. And I know, for example, Cambridge University has a divestment campaign, and Marcel over there, I think he's there, he leads the divestment campaign in this university, which I think is great, because as a university, bigger than an individual student, that's the challenge. How do you help create a better planet?
David, what can happen, actually both of those questions, what can happen to make it easier for individuals to make a difference? And do you really believe 2 degrees?
I think the real answer to this is the understanding of the existential risk ahead for humanity. And when I say the understanding, it is remarkable. I wonder how many people here know that the insurance and reinsurance business in the United States went bust last year. We all knew when the banks went bust, but we don't know that the insurance industry went bust and had to be bailed out by the US government. Now, why did they go bust? It was all of the pictures that these guys were showing you. In other words, the impact of climate change is with us today, and the understanding of the science is certainly with us today. The technologies are there, and what is missing is us working together. So the real question is, are we hopeless when it comes to collective action? Because if we are, then I'm afraid I too eventually will throw in the towel. But in order to get collective action, we need first and foremost to understand, and by we, I mean all of us, right? That is, individuals, companies, cities, governments, all of us need to understand this risk. Because governments, by the way, you know this, members of parliament respond to wanting to be elected, and if you don't like what they're doing on climate change, they should know you're going to throw them out. In other words, it's critically important that we all accept responsibility for this enormous challenge. And of course, I mean, there's a wonderful scientist in the United States, Kate Marvel, who is a great TED Talk speaker, and she's a climate scientist from NASA. She's always speaking extraordinarily well about what needs to be done. And she just announced on the 1st of this month that she's now throwing in the towel. She said, we've got to be brave as we move into the end of our civilization. And I don't think any of us want to back that up. This is the wrong moment to do it, to abandon our future and all the young people that I see in front of me.
Okay, I'm going to ask one from the internet, and then I'm going to go into the center here. And this one's specifically for you, Renee. There's a lot of apathy in Cambridge, says someone who didn't come here and is on the internet. I'm assuming that they know that they're in Cambridge to know about the apathy. But anyway, what is the best way for students to get involved with Climate Tracker?
Oh, the best way for students? Well, Climate Tracker offers a platform for you to tell your stories. So, for example, if in Cambridge, I would assume that you have a lot, it's a diverse group of students. I'm assuming you all come from different countries, from different communities. And if you have stories that you want to tell about, I don't know, climate action that's happening, or maybe climate solutions that's happening on the ground, we'd gladly share them. You can email me. I'll tell you my email. And we'd gladly communicate about that. So we also connect people, by the way. We have collaborations from different countries now going on because of Climate Tracker.
So apparently the answer is, how do you get involved with Climate Tracker? You just get involved with Climate Tracker. I'm going in the center here. One there, Jim, and there was someone back there. Come on, I know there was. There was someone, yes, there you are. So you first, sir, and then the lady behind you, behind the your right. Yeah.
Well, my name is Russ George, and about 50 years ago, when I was the age of most of the people here in the audience, I moved into the clear-cut, burned-out forests of British Columbia and started a reforestation company. It still carries on today. It's planted over 100 million trees. But some years ago, I discovered, working with industry, studying the reforestation value for carbon, that this is a blue planet, and that the rate of loss of vegetation, photosynthesis on this planet, is massively greater in the ocean than it is on land. And lots of talk here, but everybody knows about the Amazon, the plight of the Amazon. So 20% of the Amazon forest has been destroyed. But in each 5-year period since 1950, an entire Amazon forest worth of plant biomass has been eradicated from the world's oceans. So that's a dozen Amazons gone. And so I wonder why there isn't a question about about restoring the plant life in the oceans, which is singularly the greatest potential on this planet. And it costs 1/10 of 1% that it costs to reforest the land.
Okay. Lady behind you there.
My name is Sarah. Question for you. There's a lot of talk between the academia, the scientists, and the economy, but how do you bridge those gaps of getting the information out to where the simple people that Renee's talking to actually can understand it and can actually do something about it? Because they're going to be the climate refugees. They're going to be the next people that big countries are going to have to deal with. And how do you take that initiative today, so when that begins to happen and the borders start to get crowded, as it's happening already, we're ready to make a change?
Thank you very much. And we've got one from the internet here, which is, surprisingly, about geoengineering. Do we have to consider this seriously in terms of either carbon capture or mechanisms for blocking sunlight? So we have 3 questions there. First of all, are we all being just sort of like horribly terrestrialist and ignoring the ocean when we should be putting it front and center?
I would be interested in David's answer.
Okay.
But from my perspective, a couple of things. I did mention the oceans. I said they're just as important, actually, that we need to understand them. From an investment standpoint, it's quite challenging. So where there are very I suppose, sort of well-established and verified methodologies for measuring the CO2 from forests, whether avoiding the deforestation or doing the reforestation. There's not in the category of what we kind of call blue carbon yet. It would be nice if there was, and so that's got to be an area of focus. For the fund that funds Ecosphere Plus, their next fund, they did the Althelia Climate Fund, which is a land fund. Their next one's the Sustainable Ocean Fund. So it is happening. They are looking, but it's actually taken quite a long time to really get the message out there that there's an opportunity. So I think we probably need more engagement, but you're absolutely right. They're a big sink too, and they are important.
And I thought about the other question about the gaps in discourse, about the difficulty of communicating this information between the various different specialist groups. Do we just have to sort of like fill up halls in Cambridge and talk to everyone on a very regular basis?
I think if I learned anything in my career, it's just, what for me is translating it into things people understand. Getting it into the language they understand, and I don't mean, Chinese versus English. I mean, if you're speaking to engineers, they have a very different language than when you're talking to someone that's a financier or somebody actually that just wants to make a difference in their daily life. A little bit like what I talked about with individuals. A ton of carbon, which is what we trade the carbon market on, doesn't really mean anything to anybody. But actually, if we could understand the grams of carbon in a product, the way we understood the calories in a product, that would probably make more sense to us on an everyday basis. So, for me, it's about translation and a willingness to kind of have that dialogue.
David, oceans, geoengineering?
Well, I think
discourse?
We're fortunate to have Russ George here. He's a champion. He's done some very good work on iron fertilization. He's been criticized by many people who are worried about unintended consequences. But this possibility is so important. I think, just as Lisa was saying, I think that this really has to be taken very seriously as a potential enormous opportunity. Can I just say something about the information gap?
Yes, absolutely.
To public communication, because really, the minute I moved into government in the year 2000, that was my job, was talking to people who had never been trained as scientists, hadn't done any A-level science, etc. Now, what is interesting is nobody's mentioned the climate skeptic movement in the United States. Please note, funded by the Koch brothers, the owners of most of the coal mines in the United States, and funded to the extent of something like $500 million a year. Massively successful. And in the post-Copenhagen era, when they attacked the UEA climate gate, it was not only the scientists at UEA that were under attack. When Sir Paul Nurse became president of the Royal Society, he went on television making a speech about the importance of climate change. He was attacked at every level by these skeptics. I've been attacked at every level. I've just developed a very thick skin. But most of these climate scientists withdraw from the public domain and get back to publishing papers in journals because they really don't want to have to put up with the flack. Now, I'm afraid to say to them, really, we've just got to do this because it is our job to communicate what we're doing, and especially if we are good communicators. So I think absolutely essential to manage that gap.
Okay, incidentally, I was communicated with very clearly about the fact that we should have been out of here 5 minutes ago at the beginning. So I'm going to, at this stage, give Renee the last word on any of those subjects that questions have just been asked about.
I think with communications, we forget that traditionally we understand the world through stories. I mean, that's why we have mythologies. That's how we understand the world. We have stories about how the world was created. And we need to go back to that. We need to be able to tell stories. Climate change is an abstract thing. We don't understand it. What is climate change? We can't touch it. We can't feel it. We need people to understand it. And for them to understand it, we need to tell stories and make them see it, make them hear it, make them feel it. And I think that's important.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all very much. We'll be wrapping up now. As Renee said before, it's about stories, it's about people, but it is also about radical composting. Thank you very much and good night.
Well
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're brilliant on that. You know your job.
Thank you very much for coming along tonight. On your way out, if you'd like to put your contact details on the contact list if you want to be kept informed of CCLS events in the future. And thanks again to all our panelists and to Oliver.